I can't hear you, sir. No, we can't.
Hello? You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me? You can hear me now, please?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. We practiced earlier. So it's my pleasure to introduce members of the panel, and that will end my own responsibility. The chair of this panel is very famous. It's already well known in various circles. Chido Onuma, who is a journalist, human rights activist, author. He wrote the famous book, We Are All Biafrans, among other books, and is the coordinator of the African Center for Media and Information Literacy. He went to school in Nigeria, University of Calabar, and then in Canada, Western University, London, and he holds a PhD from Barcelona in Spain. He will moderate this program. It's also my pleasure to introduce Cynthia, very well known, co-founder of Yaga Africa, director of programs, and in the last 16 years, she has worked on supporting sustainable democracies. And as a director of program, she has participated and led different election observation. Welcome to the program, Cynthia. We are grateful you are here. Professor Jibri Ibrahim, very notable figure in discussing democracy, human rights, senior fellow with the Center for Development. And he was the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, a regular columnist, public intellectual. His writings are published every week. And distinguished, last but not the least, also very well known, is Aisha, who once ran for election, wrote a book on it, and she's the vice president for Open Society. She's so prominent in discussing Nigerian politics. Welcome. Let me apologize for the small hitch at the beginning. We practiced, but anything can happen at any time. For those of you who are familiar with this program, we use Zoom as a streaming device. The majority of our audience are watching live on radio stations, TV stations, Facebook, and Twitter. So there's this technology that allows us to use Zoom to now to stream and restream to other platforms. And people have joined us in various countries. We've received support from Mainframe. They're streaming it as we talk. Sometimes Sarah reporters, they join us, and some other media and radio outlets. Thank you very much. let me withdraw to the background for Chido to take over. Thank you. No.
Finally.
Now, yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of Professor Toyin Falola and the Toyin Falola interviews, I warmly welcome all of us to what can we hear some sound? Some echo that's not allowed. Okay. Sorry about that. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of Professor Toyin Falola and the Toyin Falola interviews, I warmly welcome all of us to what promises to be a fascinating edition of the Toyin Falola interviews on the 2023 elections in Nigeria. My name is Chido Onuma, and I'll be joined by three distinguished Nigerians, Professor Jibril Ibrahim, Aisha Osori, and Cynthia Mbamalo. The presidential election that took place in Nigeria on February 25th was the seventh since the country returned to democracy in 1999. And depending on who you ask, it was the worst or the best election the country has had. We will spend the next 2 hours examining the elections and the fallouts with our panel and members and the audience. Once again, I welcome you. We've lost a bit of time, so I don't need to go any further. Professor Falola has done a generous introduction of the guests, the panelists. I would go directly to my first question for the panel. We'll try and spend about 60 minutes with the panel, and then the other half of the conversation will get intervention from the audience in form of questions and responses. Questions and responses. The noises. There's a noise coming. Okay, so we'll start by looking at giving members of the panel about 3 minutes to just generally give us their overview of the just concluded elections, both at the national and state levels. But before they do that, I'd like their quick take on what has or is becoming a fiasco as far as the Adamawa State's elections are concerned, and also the report this morning by Premium Times about who won the elections in Rivers State. Professor Jibril Ibrahim, if you start by responding to those two issues, and then give us in 3 minutes your general take overview of the elections. Sorry, kindly unmute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I was saying the events in Adamawa today are very illustrative of the types of issues that follow our elections, because the narrative of election is always narrative of doing the wrong, breaking all the rules, and getting outcomes that do not represent what has happened.
I didn't hear you, sir.
Sorry?
Kindly check the volume of the audio.
The volume.
Audio.
Okay, I can speak louder. Is it better now?
Okay, yeah, it's better now.
Okay. So I was saying the events in Adamawa this morning are quite illustrative of the problems we tend to have around our elections, which was first and foremost the irregularity of having somebody who is not a returning officer announce results. And in making those announcements, what was scored by candidates was not even listed, it was simply a blanket declaration that somebody has won without giving us numbers. And of course, that created a huge crisis in terms of the irregularity of it all. And at the end, INEC at the national level had to step in, suspend the announcement, and call the operatives, as it were, to Abuja to explain such irregularities. And the point I'm trying to make is that such stories of irregularities tend to mask a lot the reality of a lot of our elections. And when one looks at this last general election, both in February 25th and 15th of March, my sense is that a lot of the elections went on quietly, were successful. The results announced were credible. Nonetheless, what people took home from these elections are narratives of mass disenfranchisement, narratives of change of outcomes. And such narratives do not come accompanied by concrete evidence that these things were the substantial events that characterize the entire election. What this does is that it makes it very difficult to discuss in a serene manner a lot of these issues around the election. And I feel that too many people make up their minds a priori about the outcome of election. And once the outcome is known, then it becomes simply either an affirmation of what has been said or a negation. And in so doing, the substance of the election is rarely looked at. I hope we'll have a chance to come back to the question of the substance of the election. I'll stop there.
Exactly, Prof. Thank you for your intervention. We'll go into details. There are a number of issues that have come up, both in terms of those who covered the election and international observers as well. Let me go to Cynthia. On your behalf, some people are being. Somebody should take control. Some intruders are trying to. Sorry about that. I think the crew, the Toyin Falola crew, you need to take control of the platform. Some people are trying to break in. Back to you, Cynthia. Your organization, Yaga Africa, participated actively in the process. Looking at what the information we're getting on the ground in Adamawa, what would be your assessment? And then, of course, we speak to your general overview of the election itself.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're listening from. I think it's interesting we're having this while we have the supplementary elections happening, or rather we had the supplementary elections yesterday and the results were coming in as of last night. We're hoping for announcements today. But like Professor Jibo already mentioned about the incident in Adamawa, I think it's just an indication that there is still a major challenge when it comes to One, the independence and capacity of the Electoral Commission, INEC as an institution created by the Constitution to manage our elections. The other is also around the question around the compliance to the rules of the game, basically the electoral legal framework. And what basically played out in Adamawa indicates that, one, when it comes to elections management, and this also connects to the national elections and how elections are managed. The questions of the independence of the individuals who manage the institution at both the national and state level is very important and critical, because it is called Independent National Electoral Commission for a reason. And if the mode of appointment and the mode of constitution of the leadership of the commission at the national and state level does not guarantee its independence, its neutrality and non-partisanship, then there would always be questions. And so we're not surprised to see the REC trying to act in breach of the rules and taking over the role of announcing results when the Electoral Act is clear that only returning officers has the power to announce or declare results. The only time INEC comes in is where there is a report that there is really a violation of the rule, or where there is a report that the results were not announced in line with the law. That is the only time there is a power of review based on the new introduction to the Electoral Act. So it's unfortunate we're seeing this, but it just shows, or rather it projects the major gap when it comes to the independence of the commission. And if you remember, at the time of appointment of some of the resident electoral commissioners, lots of civil society organizations called out on some individuals that were nominated by the president because there were questions around their neutrality, questions around their capacity, and even questions around their integrity for some of them. But those calls were not adhered to, and they were all confirmed and given, and immediately given the opportunity to resume work. So this just raises the question of there are things that needs to be done around the independence of the commission, but also the question around what do you do where the adequate sanctions for RECs who undermine the credibility of the process at both the national level, national elections and these supplementary elections, and even officials of the commission. So if I build on this to talk around general assessment, to the national elections, I would say one, the elections, we expected the elections to be competitive and contentious, and which was what we did see. However, when it comes to elections, especially for competitive and contentious elections, there are several interests at play. And once once you have those kinds of interests at play, perception is almost everything. And why do I say perception is almost everything? Now, while you have a lot of people focusing on the outcome of the elections, but we have a process that leads to the outcome. And at any point in time in competitive elections, once there are questions around the process, it creates doubt. And once you create doubt, you create distrust in the outcome, which is what we're beginning to see. So no matter how we discuss the elections, the major challenge with the elections is not because this is the worst elections we've had. I don't believe this is the worst elections we've had as a country. However, I believe it's an elections that a lot of hope was built before the elections, especially with the passage of the new Electoral Act, which did introduce specific innovations that inspired confidence in the supposed transparency of the process. So when you build hope, where citizens believe that certain things have been put in place to mitigate electoral fraud and malpractices, and then citizens begin to believe that this framework in place did not serve its purpose, it raises major questions. So that is what we're experiencing in these elections. Not because it's the worst we've had, but just because there were certain things that were to be done that were not done, and the Electoral Commission in itself did not provide that leadership when it ought to have provided the leadership. And so, while we could say that there were things that worked in these elections, that its level of competition did show that yes, Nigeria truly is a multi-party democracy, because we did see a contest beyond two parties in the presidential elections, and even in some states at the lower elections. So we could say that yes, we are truly a multi-party democracy, and you had some level of fair competition in some of the offices. And we can also say that the technology at some levels did work. However, the major question is when it comes to our assessment of the elections, perhaps we need to start reviewing what standards we want to assess our elections on, what are the minimum standards, and what is the integrity quotient for our elections, and when do we as a people assess from a point of objectivity to truly deal with the issues, just so that we do not constantly operate in a system of let's just keep moving. As long as we're moving, that is what is important. We need to also ensure that as we are moving, that we're moving in the right direction, and that we're moving with the right principles and with everyone on board. So that will be my initial comments. And I will
thank you very much, Cynthia. We'll get to specific in terms of technology and perception, BVAS and IREV. But Aisha, let's hear from you, your take. First, the Adamawa fiasco, and then your general overview of the election.
Thank you, Chido. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you're listening and joining us from. So my impressions of Adamawa are pretty much similar to my impressions of the general 2023 elections, but I'll start with Adamawa specifically, since that happened only yesterday. And I would say three things. The reason why we had an Adamawa in the first place was because of, just to put it in context for those who are not following very clearly, we had supplementary elections in 24 states, and in only 2 of them was the gubernatorial seat up for contention, which was Adamawa and Kebbi. Now, in both cases, it was about the fact that there were more cancelled votes than the difference between the 2 leading participants. And because cancelled votes have played such a prominent role, let's put it that way, in the Osun elections, which are the last elections that we had before the general elections, we need to start asking, what is it about cancelled votes? Why do we have so many cancelled votes? Because there are some who think maybe there was even no need for us to have a supplementary election for the gubernatorial seats in Adamawa and in Kebbi. In Kebbi, for example, out of 21 local governments, you had 20 local governments with cancelled votes. You have up to 90,000 cancelled votes. What is this about? Why do we have so many cancelled votes? Especially since we have the discretion of electoral officers who can cancel the votes in a polling unit if there's overvoting by just 1 single ballot paper. So that's a very heavy discretion that they have. So for me, I can't disassociate Adamawa and what's going on there from the general way that we've been conducting elections. That's 1. 2, the quality of the people who end up as electoral officers, resident electoral commissioners, even returning officers. I think that's a big question. The quality of the people who end up in these positions, we need to start having a more thorough due diligence about who they are, what their antecedents are, who they're associated with. And I think that actually matters. And there was lots of stories in the run-up to, the presidential elections and the gubernatorial, about how it seems the staff, whoever ends up in position of authority, sometimes even seems fluid. So I think for me, that's also a critical part, because as you can see, the REC played a very prominent role in the charade that's going on. So how did he come to be in this kind of powerful position? And despite the fact that he was suspended, how come, according to reports, he came in with the commissioner of police and he came in with the head of DSS in the state? So these are all authority figures. So how did this all come to be? And I think for me, the third thing about Adamawa is consequences. Will we see any? Because this is not the first time we've seen things like this. So we had in 2019, Rochas Okorocha, who was the incumbent governor, but outgoing, and who wanted a Senate seat, and where the returning officer said that he made the announcement of Rochas as the winner under duress. So one account says with the gun to his head, but what consequences did anybody face for that? Rochas still ended up keeping his seat. So I think for me, you can't disassociate what goes on, what happened in Adamawa today, with just the general way in which we hold elections. And then speaking more specifically about the 2023 elections, I'll to what my fellow panelists have already said. And for me, the thing is, I have a lot of doubt about the integrity of the 2023 elections. And that's because I cannot disassociate where we are as a country in terms of governance, in terms of the quality of governance, in terms of the quality of accountability and transparency, of the way elected officials conduct themselves as if they have zero regard for Nigerians. And I cannot disassociate that arrogance to the fact that they know how they win elections. So we've had a long history of rigging elections in Nigeria, and I don't suddenly believe that because we introduced BVAS and IREF, suddenly those people who typically are used to rigging elections will suddenly just go to sleep. And I want permission to be able to quote something in particular. So the principal forms of rigging and fraud were perfected in the elections, this is the quote, in 1964, 1965, 1979, 1983, 1999, and 2003. The result is that the outcome of elections has been the subversion of the democratic process rather than its consolidation. And this quote is from Amadou Kofi, and the name of the book is Nigerian General Elections 1951 to 2003, My Rules and Reminiscences. And I would add 2007, maybe some people would add 2011 and 15. I would add 2019. And of course, here we are in 2023. So yes, there was a lot of hope that with the introduction of technology, we would see something better. But I don't think that the results alone, the fact that it was a hard contested election, especially on the presidential level, is enough to say that there was no rigging and this is a great election. To focus on the results means that we're sort of saying, here's the answer, let's walk back to it. Because there is a thing as competitive authoritarianism. So you can have competitive elections, but you're not becoming more democratic. So for me, that's the worry for those who focus on the results and how close it was in terms of the spread and this and that. That's a distraction from the fact that the process for me was deeply flawed, starting with many things, even pre the elections, including the quality of the recs, the quality of the commissioners, how independent INEC is as a body, then all the way into the refusal of the chairman to wait until all the results had been collated and uploaded, which is what he promised us, before announcing the results. And so people are actually even making a reference, speaking about Adamawa, to say, if the rec, who obviously shouldn't have, who's been suspended and has no authority. But if, let's just say for devil's advocacy's sake, that it wasn't him, it was the returning officer who came in and made the announcement when the collation is still going on. And we have examples of that. We had Iwu in 2007, and arguably we had Yakubu on February 26th or 27th, or whenever he announced the results, that you have not finished uploading. You had 20%, but yet you went ahead and announced. So this is, again, a precedent, and this is also what we see is no consequences for actions. That's, for me, one of the key things about how I feel about the 2023 elections. The other was the state of this quality of state elections. And Chudo, you alluded to a news story from Premium Times today that says, from their review of the results, in Rivers State specifically, which obviously Rivers State has also been, one of the places where for years we've hardly had credible elections there. 2019 was a fiasco, and we've seen again in 2023. And so in that article, they say, for example, that in one particular polling unit, APC originally scored 17, but the number 2 was added to the figure. So it will read 217. And for the Labour Party, it was 227, but the number 2 was erased. And I'd like to point out that till yesterday, when I checked the IREF portal, you still have less than 100% of the results uploaded. So it's about 6%, which comes to over 10,600 polling unit results that are still not uploaded. So where are these results? The same way in 2019, we never saw a breakdown by state. First time ever. I've not seen a breakdown by state for 2019 presidential elections that tell you Kano State, PDP got this, APC got that, whatever party got next. We don't have that breakdown. So for me, no, these elections in 2023 were lacking integrity, the same way they were lacking integrity in 2019. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And thank you all panel members for your great take assessment of. Now let's go to specific. Talking about the elections being flawed, whether it's in terms of use of technology or uploading the results. Professor Jibo, I'd like to come to you. I don't know if you've been able to go through the report of the story in Premium Times today concerning the Rivers State election. Cynthia raised 2 important issues, both in the whole question about technology, the expectation, but also the perception, the whole idea of whether the election was done properly or not matters. They are more than some would say the outcome. What's your take on the story in premium times, and then what does that do to the one perception, but also how the election is looked at going forward, both in terms of the legal framework or the fact that the case is in court now?
Well, I didn't read the premium time story.
Okay.
I'm not aware of the story, so let somebody else read it respond to that.
Okay, well then we'll leave that. So here it's and again I'm back to you, Professor Jibril. Professor Mahmoud Yakub was shown in pre-election video where he promised that with the introduction of BVAS and INEC would conduct the best election ever. Comparing such confidence-boosting statements with the reports of international observers on the election, which at least some were not altogether flattering, what would we say in terms of the promises made and what INEC delivered? You're muted, Prof. You're muted. Okay.
Can you hear
fine.
me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. What was important about this election was that the Electoral Commission designed an integrity test and sold it successfully to Nigerians. And it was a very convincing sell. And the integrity test had two components. One component, which is the key component, is BVAS. And what that does is that it tells you exactly how many voters turned up to vote, which means you cannot, as has been the case in the past, simply write up numbers, because the numbers that turned up are known, and any number beyond that then becomes debt. The second component of the integrity test is the IREV, which is a public portal where results from the polling units are sent directly to the portal so that everybody can see the results as they come out. The purpose of IREV is that we know from the sociology of previous elections that elections are seldom rigged at the polling units. It is from the ward to the local government collation centers the results are rigged and numbers change. So the idea of giving the polling unit numbers, everybody on a public portal, is a brilliant one. And that really created confidence in the election. When the elections came, basically BVAS worked, which is the technology guarantee for the elections, but the public portal didn't work. And the fact that the public portal didn't work created serious doubts among Nigerians on the veracity of the entire numbers in the election. Aisha was just saying she's still not seen some of the results on IREV, and nobody in the country is happy with IREV. But IREV is not the integrity test of the election. The election results are what's in the form EC8HF, and those are what you need to ascertain the veracity of the numbers, and that's what's in the electoral act. But because what people see or don't see is very important in how they make up their minds about issues. All attention has been on Iraq. My sense, and virtually all the observer reports, confirm that on the whole, Beavers work. And if everybody is surprised at the very low numbers in these elections, precisely because Beavers work and people couldn't fabricate and add numbers in terms of turnout to the election. So I think the essential of the integrity test worked. The public presentation was a woeful failure, and it's really unfortunate that INEC, after the beautiful promotion they did of that portal, at the end could not deliver on it. It means that forever this election will be tainted. But you see, elections are about process. I followed the elections of 20th, February in Kano, very close, for example. And what was it? What's the story of the 25th February elections in Kano? It was that there was violence, that people were killed, and that the results were changed by a famous lawmaker we all know. And that is all true. But when you review the entire elections of the 25th in Kano, the affected polling units are between 5 and 6% of the total polling units in the state. In the other 94, 95%, the elections were smooth. And the more people you talk to in Kano about the elections, the more they will tell you these elections have very high levels of integrity. So we now live in a context in which you look for the scandal, and the scandal colors the outcome. Rather than say, which is what we should be doing, what was the process? What's important about elections is not really the outcome, but the process. And if, as in the case in Kano, the process in 95% of the polling units was good, smooth, and the results had integrity, then you cannot dismiss the Kano elections because there was violence in Tumod and Ankade, and people were killed there, and that became the big story of the election. In a lot of states, that's the reality of these elections. And it was the fact that the process itself was sound in most places. That was why we had surprising outcomes in which many governors, for example, who in the past were able to always determine outcomes, this time found out they could not determine outcome because the core of elections was, of course, there are states. Rivers State has been one in which in almost all the elections of the Fourth Republic, the Electoral Commission has been prevented from being able to organize the free and fair and credible elections by simply putting guns, thugs, and violence on the streets on election day. And these agents are able to determine outcomes. And I think part of what we need to do in this country is to be able to do an assessment of elections based on what happened in majority of polling units rather than the sensational cases that provide headlines for the media. And I find, to conclude on this specific question, that a lot of people don't appear to even know how elections are conducted. I've had a lot of people say, chairman of INEC simply rigged the election. The chairman of INEC cannot rig elections because he doesn't conduct elections. Who conducts elections in this country? There are 774 local government electoral officers. They are the ones who control and run the elections. And an INEC chairman sitting in Abuja doesn't even have access to them directly during the elections and is not able to do what he wants as it were. Looking back at the entire history of our elections in this country, there has been only one case in which an INEC chairman has sitting down and written falsified results, and that's 2007 with Maurice Tiu. That's the only time that has happened. And when that happened, everybody knew exactly what was happening. So when people reach conclusions about INEC changing results and all that, it also means they are not looking at the process. And the process of Nigerian elections is that you have 774 people running those elections. Most of them run them quite well. Some of them are corrupt, take money, and do all sorts of illegal things during the election process. And if people really want to start analyzing and understanding what happens in elections, they have to go back to those 774 people who run and operate Nigerian elections.
I don't mean to cut you, but just to take you up on that quickly, if we know that this is possible, and as we would say, you are a political scientist, when you talk about governance and leadership, they say the buck stops at the table of the president, in this case, the INEC chair. Is it then possible that the INEC chair has the power to overrule some of these things and ensure that where there is doubt or where there is clear evidence that these things are, that these issues are dealt with effectively? Isn't that a possibility? You're muted, sir. Okay.
Okay. And that's precisely why, in fact, following the case in Imo State, where somebody had a gun held on his head and given false results as returning officer and told to read it, and he read it, and it went to court, and the court said, well, the law does not say that if you have a gun on your head, that decision is illegal. And they accepted that result. INEC made strong representation to the National Assembly that this issue of review of results that are announced falsely must be made in the Electoral Act, and it was made. And that's why this time it has been possible for INEC to intervene in cases where the outcomes announced had problems, did not follow the rules, or were clearly false. Nigeria's election has always been a process of how political actors devise ways to beat the rules. And that's why you have to constantly improve the rules so that it becomes possible to go around what some of those political actors are capable of doing.
Thank you very much, Prof. You talked about process outcomes, and we'll look at consequences of this process and outcomes. But Cynthia, quickly, again, you and your team were on the ground across the country. And so I'd like to discuss specifics here, in this case, the beavers. And I think it's one of the major issues in terms of whether the people talking about how effective or how free and fair the election was. And I don't know if INEC has conclusively addressed this or been able to put forward some answer that resonates with the public. So what do we know that happened? INEC talked about glitches in terms of beavers and upload of PU results real time for National Assembly vis-a-vis the presidential election. What do we know, and how could that have been averted or dealt with?
Yeah, thank you. So for the elections, technology the technology plays two major roles. The first is the bimodal voter accreditation system, the BVAS, is deployed to accredit voters. And the new Electoral Act makes it mandatory that only those accredited by the BVAS would be allowed to vote. And so that was the first part. Deployment to accredit voters to ensure that every voter is captured. In fact, the law is so emphatic that where the BVAS is not deployed, the elections for that polling unit to be suspended and conducted the following day. And so some of the instances where we had inconclusive elections, some reasons were also some polling units did not have the BVAS, so they could not vote. And that added to the number of cancelled polling units. So that's one part. Now, the other part of technology is at the end of voting in every polling unit, the BVAS is used to take a picture of the results form. That's the polling unit results form EC8A at the polling unit level. So EC8A is the result form at the polling unit level. The BVAS is used to take a picture of form EC8A and uploaded on the INEX results viewing portal. So that's the second part of it. In fact, what the guideline for that introduces is at the point of conclusion of voting, the presiding officer at the polling unit uses the BVAS to send the data of accredited voters to a back-end server and then takes a picture of the results and uploads on the result portal before proceeding to the next level of collation. So for the presidential elections, the value chain of results management begins from the polling unit level. So there is the presiding officers write the results at the polling unit. It moves to the results collation officers, where the results collation officers collate the results for each polling unit and put that together per word. Then it moves to the local government collation centers, where the local government collation officers collate the results from every ward and impute that on the result sheet at the collation center, which is from EC8C, because EC8B is that at the ward level. Then it moves to the national collation, where you have the returning officer. Now, the national collation, the results for every local government is collated on from EC8D. That is what is then declared by the returning officer. At the state level, before it moves to the national for presidential elections, because you have polling units, ward, local government, states collation, and then national, which is where you have the one you have in Abuja. Now, I wanted to provide what the results process looks like. Now, with the amendment to the Electoral Act, if we remember, there's a context to electronic transmission of results. And I think if we understand the context, we would also appreciate why there was a lot of hope on the results viewing portal. First, for all of us who work on elections, and every Nigerian who observes elections, we know that the results collation process was the weakest link, or is the weakest link in our elections. Because at the polling unit, you are there to observe, but once you move from polling unit, you can't really make sense of what happens to the result process. And when the amendment process commenced to the Electoral Act, one major issue that citizens rallied themselves around was the issue of electronic transmission of results. If we remember that in 2021, when the National Assembly voted on the electoral bill, the Senate had introduced the NCC, the Communications Commission, giving it power to determine if INEC can deploy electronic transmission of results. And INEC had given out this big, beautiful policy brief saying it had conducted an assessment nationwide, and it is certain that it can deploy electronic transmission of results, because there were blind spots, but those blind spots were not substantial, and that there is sufficient infrastructure technology-wise to do this. And this informed civil society support around these issues. In fact, if you follow the Twitter conversation around the electoral amendment, a lot of young people on Twitter were basically pushing for electoral technology. And there was a huge demand that the Senate reverses its vote. That was one section of the bill where there was a recommittal, because Nigerians called their lawmakers and the lawmaker just had to recommit and revote. And then what was done was the section was amended, NCC was taken out. And what was now there was INEC has the power to electronically transmit results. So the new law now provided for that power, right? Now, INEC made its guidelines, the the INEC guidelines 2022, which was the guidelines that regulated the elections. In the guidelines, if you look at the process on collation, there are provisions that at the point of collation, one, it is clear that the electronic does not substitute the manual. So now I'm on the collation part because we are done with accreditation. Electronic transmission doesn't substitute, however, it complements. And what is required in the guidelines is that at the point of collation, a comparison is made with the manual and that is uploaded. In fact, there's a particular article that provides that where there is discrepancy, the result uploaded would be given premium. Where there's discrepancy between what was written in the manual that was transferred manually and that was uploaded electronically. So if you want to look at the basis of the guidelines, and let's remember that while a guideline is a policy and the Electoral Act supersedes the guidelines, but once INEC provides, or the Electoral Act gives INEC the power to make its guideline, and in the guideline, INEC, if you read the preamble, is this guideline shall, and in law, the term shall is mandatory. So the guidelines subsist until a new guideline is in place to make the older one inconsequential. But currently, that is the guideline we're working on. So when it came to technology, two things. Accreditation. Our data did show that, yes, BVAS was deployed in 99% of our sampled polling units across the local government areas, because we had polling units, sampled polling units across the LGAs. It was deployed. In 8% of the polling units, it malfunctioned but was fixed. It functioned properly, but in 8% of the polling, 8% it functioned properly. In 8% it functioned with some issues, but it was fixed. There's only about 1% of polling units where there were issues with the BVAS, which is why we have some polling units where elections did not hold because the BVAS did not work. So if you think about deployment and usage for accreditation, it did work. And so we know that the BVAS does work. So that's the first part. Now, on the results part, our data did show that in 88% of our polling units, the BVAS was used to take a picture of the results from EC8A at the polling unit level. Remember that EC8A is the result sheet at the polling unit level. And in about 68% of the polling, or 68 or 69% of the polling units, the presiding officer attempted to upload the results on the result viewing portal. Now, this is for the presidential election, because we focus on the presidential elections, which was why, as an organization, when because from 2 p.m. we're on the portal, because you're waiting for elections were to end from 2:30. So you're expecting that by 2 p.m. everyone should be watching the result portal. But as at 10 p.m. on elections day, there was no results for presidential elections on the viewing portal. Now, where we had a major challenge was if in 69% an attempt was made to upload, we were expecting that at least towards 10 p.m. on elections, there about 69% of the results would be on the portal, because we know that 88% they took a picture, and we're expecting that perhaps you should have a reasonable percentage on the portal. So the question is, which is the question for INEC, and I can't speak for INEC because you asked the question around technological glitch or not, is that while we had 3 elections for 25th of February, presidential, Senate, and the House of Representatives. Now, the same system applies for all 3 elections. We could observe that on the portal, the results for the Senate was uploaded, the result for the House of Reps was uploaded. And if it is the same technology, the same BVAS that is used for every polling unit, that is used to upload the result, the question is, why did we experience this delay in the upload of the presidential result? Because if there is a technological glitch, it should affect all. This is the same system and it's the same BVAS that is used. And so that is where that creates a major question. And I think it's important for the INEC is yet to respond to this. It gave a statement and it proceeded with the governorship elections. We're yet to get, I'm sure perhaps they are conducting their internal audit. I'm not sure, but that's one. You. Yes, I wanted to bring this all together. Now, because we know that technology in itself does not guarantee integrity in the election. I think Aisha also made that point, that the fact we had technology deployed doesn't mean that the elections automatically becomes credible. But the thing is, technology works based on those who deploy and use it. So if there is a major question around transparency and integrity of the process, the major conversation in these elections now is even beyond the technology, but around the compliance to the rules and the conduct of the officials at all levels, beyond the national, at every level where you had officials deployed, who gave the instruction that you could proceed with collation even when results were not uploaded. And at the point of the elections, there was no point where the commission addressed the public to say, okay, we have major challenge, so we're setting aside this procedure on the IREF's part and we'll proceed with that. And then the last part around collation is, with the new Electoral Act, Section 65 now gives INEC the power to review results if results are not announced in line with three things. The Act mentions the Electoral Act, the guideline, and the manual. Now, the manual is broad. If you read the manual, that is what the officials are trained with. If it's not declared in line with that, or if it was not declared voluntarily, then INEC can review. And that brings back to the point of the whole commission around results concludes with the point of announcement. There was nothing withholding or limiting the national the chair of the national INEC at the national level to, at a point, say, okay, there have been complaints raised. Since there are complaints raised, before final declaration, we have the powers to review and proceed to review, because the guidelines now provide clarity on how reviews will be done and says a report is made. A report is made and INEC considers the report and reviews the results. So there were also opportunities by the new law and the guideline to give INEC that power to even consider reviews if questions were raised around the result process. And I do believe that those opportunities were not duly explored. And once you don't leverage opportunities in the law that helps promote some sense of transparency, then it creates a major question on doubt when it comes to the outcome. And I think that is what we're dealing with. At the end of it all, the Electoral Commission, INEC, the chair of the commission, had the power within the law to ensure that this process was properly managed, because it claimed that there was a technological glitch. Let's say that happened, but we did not see that level of commitment on the part of the leadership to address these issues before declaring, especially because our law does not provide a specific date on when results will be declared. It just provides that declaration ought to be made when the process and procedures are properly adhered to and concluded with. So there was no need for any major hurry, especially because questions were raised. And until INEC speaks to us, there are still a lot of unanswered questions based on the reports from the field.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that illuminating background. I shall come to you, but once again, let's thank everybody for joining us. People are itching to ask questions. We spent almost one half of the conversation. We will soon open the space for questions and responses. We've been looking at the process and outcomes. I want us to look at consequences. My understanding, and the panel is free to prove me wrong, that by May 29, we'll have somebody sworn in as president of Nigeria. Aisha, coming to you, many Nigerians would argue that the country has never been more divided in the aftermath of a general election. People could say that for the first time, this intense wave of ethnic and religious bigotry during and after the election. Knowing how fragile our democracy is, what's the likely consequences of this division, mutual antagonism, and lack of trust in a country that is working to consolidate democracy?
Thanks, Chido, for that question. I mean, before I answer, I'm sorry, I still need to say just a little bit about this BVAS and IREV, even though I know Cynthia has given a very exhaustive response. And I also just want to ask her a question because it's something that in spirit of the conversation, and she doesn't have to answer now, and maybe when next she gets a chance. But Yaga deployed about, 3,836. So for me, when you take that as a percentage of the over 176,000 polling units, that means you had like less than 2.5% coverage. So when you say 88%, when you say 68%, you're talking about that 2.1%, right? The 2.1% that you actually covered, because I think it's important. When, for those of us who did law and didn't do sciences and so are challenged by numbers, and we understand what you're talking about. So it'd be nice to get that clarity. Chido, before I talk about the unity of Nigeria, because I think the reason why the elections are so contentious, obviously, is partly because we're so divided. And again, it's not unique to Nigeria. More and more countries, we're seeing that, you know, elections are like a substitute for war. One of the reasons, and there are many reasons, obviously, with what's going on in the world, why elections are becoming more and more contentious, but at least one reason is this sense that, you know, if the other side gets in, it so radically changes things that, you know, the world will never be the same. I think that's the feeling. It's almost like an existential issue that if somebody else, without your ideology, without your sense of, you know, how you define your values, gets into power, they make so many fundamental changes that, yeah, it's almost like the end of the world. So in that context, yes, what's the future of Nigeria's unity? To be honest, I have no idea. Are these elections more contentious in terms of ethnicity and religion than, let's say, the 1965 ones, or even the one in 1959 before the handover? I don't know. I think we've lived with these religious and ethnic tensions for such a long time that I'm not sure we know what to do with ourselves if we didn't have it. So it's anybody's guess. I would say that, you know, it depends on how the new administration brings people together on side. It depends on how we build a sense of justice, which includes beyond just the executive, but also the judiciary. But honestly, I'm going back to the IREV BVAS question, because, you know, I think it's very important to say that Section 60 subsection 5 of the Electoral Act doesn't actually even mention electronic transmission at all. It just actually says the votes and the accredited numbers will be transmitted and it shall be up to INEC. Basically, the words are as in a manner prescribed by the commission. So BVAS not mentioned, IREV not mentioned, but what is mentioned over and over again by the chairman of INEC was that they were going to use BVAS and they're going to use IREV, and it's going to be a game changer. INEC actually said that these two technological innovations were going to address the most pervasive weaknesses in Nigeria's election result management process, and went on to even list them. And I have to list them here because I think it's very important. Falsification of votes at polling units, falsification of number of accredited voters, collation of false results, mutilation of results and computational errors, swapping of result sheets, forging of result sheets, snatching and destruction of result sheets, obtaining declaration and return involuntarily, making declarations and returns while result collation is still in progress. I think I need to repeat that one. Making declaration and return while result collation is still in progress, and poor record keeping. This is all captured in an article by Samson Utodo for Yaga in IDEA just at the end of last year. And we even had a quote from the chairman days before the elections in February, where he said, after the process is completed at the polling unit, the image of the polling unit result will be taken by the BVAS and uploaded into what we call the INEC result viewing portal, that's IREV, where citizens can see polling unit level results as the processes are completed at the polling unit level. And that's what didn't happen. And now, because of that, and again, I think, Chido, this also even speaks a little bit to your question about unity. Now the mantra is go to court. So everybody's headed to court. And so now we're going back to the dark days of pre-2015, 2011, where we had the judiciary making, weighing in on almost 90%. By 2007, which I guess everybody here agrees was one of the worst, almost 90% of the cases for offices contested went to court. In 2011, it dropped to 51. 2015, it dropped to 43. By 2019, which speaks to what I say about, for me, I see 2023 as a continuation of the beginning of the falling apart again of the few gains we had made. By 2019, was back up to 51%. And only God knows what it's going to be for 2023. Because if go to court is the new rallying cry, then we might see a return to 2007 figures. And again, so it's not over, Chido, in terms of speaking about unity. You cannot talk about unity if the judiciary is going to play such a huge and important role in deciding who is going to be representing us in different offices. And there's a reason why we have a governor called the Supreme Court governor. And these things are not made up. Again, we keep talking about these things in context. Of course, process is very important, but we keep talking about elections as if it's in isolation from the lives that we live. What is the state of Nigeria? And what is the connection between the state of Nigeria and how well or not well it's governed and those who get into office? And I'll just end with saying that the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission, the ICPC, that's a government agency, not civil society, says that between 2018 and 2020, $26 million was exchanged in bribes for election judgments. That's their report. So I think we also need to put that in context. When we say these things, it's not to damage the integrity just because, oh, we don't like the results. No, it's about the fact that there's a history and there's a lived experience that people are referring to as they perceive that the elections were lacking in integrity. That's it.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Quickly, just to Professor Jubre Ibrahim and then back to Cynthia before we get back to the audience. Prof, you're one of the few Nigerians that have followed the politics of this country, but also written copiously about it. Looking at the outcomes of these elections, what would you, and it seems to be an ongoing process, how is this all going to end? What would it take to heal the wounds caused by this election? And what would your response be to people who say that Nigeria will not be the same again because of how these elections have turned out? And I would want you to look at it within the context of the judiciary that Aisha spoke about, but also for me, which is the most fundamental thing, the question of nationhood itself.
Well, I think I agree with the point Aisha just made, that a situation in which increasingly electoral outcomes are decided by the judiciary in a context in which judicial decisions are increasingly affected by corruption is definitely not the way to go. And the only way to go is to really improve continuously the integrity of our electoral process. Improving the integrity of our electoral process is, however, an extremely difficult thing. My point is that these attempts have been made since 2011, and there has been considerable progress. However, we are not where we want to be, and we continue to face major challenges. Specifically, this election has the coloration of ethnic and religious bigotry due to a number of factors that makes the outcome even more contentious and problematic than is normally the case. I think the nomination process of the political parties that was based essentially on massive use of financial resources, the decision of the APC to come out with a Muslim ticket goes against the logic of Nigeria's nomination in the past. All helped create a very difficult situation where these ethnic and religious factors pose such a huge problem. But I think specifically, voter suppression policies that occurred in certain states where people from certain ethnicities were physically harassed, stopped from coming out to vote, is the greatest marker of this election. And it is a very terrible situation because you are questioning the citizenship rights of certain Nigerians that they will not be allowed to come and exercise the mandate all Nigerian citizens are to have. And if today the divisions are so strong, it's precisely because of the impact of that process. So why did that process occur? It occurred because certain people who thought they would have easy victories discovered that people were fed up with them. There are people who were fed up with them. They wanted to elect other people, and that their assumption that they control the was questioned in a very dramatic fashion. And I think that's really a very good thing. But this is where the experience of Nigerian politicians in dividing the rule comes out as being very dangerous for our democratic future. They know how to mobilize along ethnic and religious lines. And when they do that, it works significantly. And that's precisely what happened. I think it is very important to sit back after this election and to look at the ways in which voter suppression in particular became the major marker of this election and deepened the divisions in this country and devised ways of guaranteeing something that's already in all our laws and all our constitutions, that we are all citizens and we have the right to vote. So these are not rights that we don't have. So it's not an issue of saying, let's have those rights. We have them. How come political actors are able to prevent us from enjoying rights we already have? I think that conversation is very important. And if the incoming government does not take that seriously and address it in a manner that satisfies Nigerians, then overcoming the divisions that have been brought about by these elections become extremely difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quickly, finally, we'll get to Cynthia before we get to the audience. This whole concept of citizenship rights played a major, was one topical issue during this election. We may not have the time here, but looking at the reaction of citizens, especially young people during this election, Cynthia, do you think the outcome would affect the way and interest, motivation that young people have had in the last decade or so when you and your team started the whole process of not too young to run? What would be your assessment in terms of how young people view the process, outcomes, and perhaps consequences of this election?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe quickly to respond to the question Aisha raised before I come to yours. She had raised the question around our sample. Yes, so for the presidential elections, we deployed a methodology called the PVT. And what PVT does, basically, it uses statistics to randomly sample polling units. So we had a random sample of 1,500 polling units, but we deployed 2 observers per polling unit, and then we have mobile. But we get our results from the 1,500 polling unit. Now, the idea of a sample is we use 2 tools. It's called stratification and randomization, where we stratify polling units using the INEX official list of polling units. We run it in the system, and it's broken down to local government per local government, and then it randomly picks polling units across the local government. Now, what supports the quality of the PVT is that each sample is representative of a whole. So in our sampling, every local government has the percentage of polling units it has at a national level based on INEX database of polling units is the same percentage it has in our sample. That's where we can give an estimate without giving exact figures, which is why I said in 68% of our sampled polling units or in 89% of our sampled polling units. With that, we can also make projections of the results. And if you remember, Chido, you started with the Premium Times report on Rivers. And if you remember our statements, we did highlight that the results for Rivers and Imo State were inconsistent with our sample, and we noted that the results for the Labour Party was reduced. In fact, by that our statement, we had stated that the Labour Party, based on our data on results, was expected to receive 50.8% of the vote, and the All Progressive Congress was expected to receive 21.7% of the votes for Rivers. However, what the commission announced was that Labour Party had 33.4% of the votes and the All Progressive Congress had 44.2% of the vote. And we had raised that Rivers results were changed. Same also for Imo, and we can talk more about it, but I need to just provide that we may not give exact figures, but we can give estimates that shows what our assessment is within a margin of error. Most times we work within a 95% confidence in our data. And the question around youth participation, I think when it comes to elections, there would always be a winning and losing side. And for a lot of young people that follow these elections, if you engage a lot of them, beyond the factor of the third force, and the fact that there was this agitation post the NSAS movement, a lot of young people followed the election because they believe in the technology. And so they felt that with technology, the process would be more credible, and they wanted it to work. Because for them, if it works, then they can trust the system, especially in a system where we already had huge levels of mistrust or distrust. So the trust deficit was already high. And I think for young people engaging this process, especially the younger generation, the Gen Z, I'm a millennial. So if I'm thinking about the 20-year-olds who voted in these elections, the first-time voters, and for a lot of them, there's going to be a lot of work to rebuild their trust in the process, because the technology they were looking forward to, if you follow the process before the election, people were saying, I would vote and go home and download the results from the portal. So, and now they couldn't do that. So you've already affected the way they trusted the system. And there's going to be a lot to rebuilding trust in the process. But most especially is also the conversation around democracy. I think it's also important we begin to have that education across board, that elections do not equate democracy. And if you look at the VDEM report on democracy 2022, it says that there are Nigeria is an electoral autocracy, actually. That's what it was classified as. And 68% of the population in Africa live within electoral autocracies, meaning we're having periodic elections, but it doesn't mean that it is that democracy is present the way it ought to be. So the work conversation now is beyond elections. We also need to start engaging young people to engage in the process beyond just voting, to demanding accountability, getting involved in promoting for better or stronger institutions to support our democracy, but also the conversation around the participation, because for these elections, youth participation was beyond voting. We had young candidates. We had the young people that aspired to run. And I think Professor Jibo talked about the party primary process, because it's the whole gamut of the several processes that leads to the final outcome. So from the candidate nomination, the party conventions, in fact, party convention to the candidate nomination process, to the campaigns process, to the final outcome to the final voting and the outcome, there are major challenges, because as it is now, we could do all we can to build the electoral process, but if our political parties do not believe in principles, democratic principles, or even promoting democracies from their parties, if they don't believe in inclusion, then all the conversation around not too young to run, getting the law amended or getting a new electoral act would amount to nothing. But at the end, you still have the old players working with the old mentality on how they've constantly engaged the process. So candidate nomination probably rather puts youth at a major disadvantage. Post the party nomination, only 28% of the candidates were young people, and in a country with a youth population of about 60%. And we had a high percentage of youth aspiration, but the party primaries kicked away a lot of young people from the process. Now you had campaigns. A lot of young people who contested in the newer parties did not make it in, because also campaigns are expensive. And so when you think about youth participation, it was not just as voting, but for those who experienced the process as candidates or aspirants, they also have their own experience. And for some of them, they've said, why should I care about leading if the process wouldn't even give me a fair chance to compete? And so post these elections, honestly, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done as a people. One, are we ready for democracy, and what kind of democracy do we want as a country? And I know this is also within the larger context about what kind of democracy do we want as a continent. But also, how do we begin to build better education around the processes? Because the conversation around disunity or what have you, all of this have existed with us since independence. They are still here. Now they're a bit more seen because we have social media to amplify the levels of hate that goes on. Before, we didn't have social media to amplify that. Only those who had access to newspapers or experienced some level of discrimination. But now, on a daily basis, if you follow trends from social media, on Twitter in particular, issues around identity, you have debates on who is not central or middle belt, or we are Hausas or we're not Hausas. So you even have it's beyond the general Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa conversations. You also have every ethnic identity also seeking to be seen. And while we have all these issues, conflict with identities, basically borders on the quality of governance, leadership, and most especially the role of social, or rather the divisive force of social inequality. Because constantly, what we're beginning to see, several parts of the society feel a major level of injustice or exclusion or inequality that has not been addressed. And as long as young people exist within this context, the context will inform how we operate or how they engage the process. So if they've been told beyond for a long period of time, your people are not accepted or not treated rightly, or they experience some level of injustice, and they told you the reason you experience is because of you're from this tribe or from this religion, it just amplifies those inequality, those issues around identity. So for me, the bigger question is, how do we build a society that promotes social equality and justice, and a society that invests in its education? When I'm talking about civic education now, because a lot of young people engaging in the process are engaging from a point of a point of, okay, it's time, it's what is fun, it's what is trendy, so let's engage. But there is a bigger work around engagement, that participation in itself ought to be informed and ought to be properly contextualized. Because if we are not informed, we wouldn't even know how to engage the process. So when you ask questions around whether young people would engage, I can't give a yes or no response to that. I just wanted to provide all the varying factors that would affect how youth engage the process. But there's a lot of work in rebuilding trust in the system, but also showing young people that democracy does have its place in Nigeria, and that democracy has its prospect to work for the people. As it is now, people don't even trust that democracy is willing to deliver to the people their needs.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Professor Jubril. I'll get back to you. Let me quickly get to the audience. But before I do that, so if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, kindly digitally raise your hand. I don't know if Professor Falola wants to say anything before we go to the audience. Prof.
Thank you very much. It's going very well. The discussion is vibrant. The contradictions in democracy, the ambiguities between competition, democracy, and results, which have been raised, the optimism by Professor Jibril Ibrahim. I want to thank Vanguard, they're here, they've joined, Punch joined, Tribune has joined, and a number of online stations have joined. And we connected to television stations in South Africa and some other places. They normally give us report as it continues. We have an audience of 1.4 million watching the Zoom as we speak, which is going to increase because they won't file all the reports until Wednesday. But as you join on Facebook and Twitter and others, they have the concrete number, which is one of the points that one of you raised in terms of how social media has become a platform in terms of the language that she uses, enhancing various voices. Thank you. Please, I can moderate this for you by calling names, or you can do it yourself.
Yeah, I can see the names here, so I'll just call in the order
yes,
on my screen.
And then you can also, we have very many distinguished people joined by Zoom. Richard Joseph is here. We have Akeredolu, who used to be a magistrate, has joined us. Of course, many professors, as usual. We have our elder, Mrs. Evan Clark, will join us.
Dr. Kole Shetimo.
Akwasi Aidu, who used to be a program officer multiple times, founded Trust Africa, a major newspaper. A major Trust Africa in Ghana. She was a fan. She founded it, and it became transferred to other people. Thanks, Akwasi. His Poetry Week is a poem activist. We are very grateful. The head of political science, Bafemi Awolowo University, Premium Times, Ololade, I could see you. If I don't mention your name, Olubi, Shetima, Adewumi, the head of history, University of LASU, and so many distinguished people who have joined us. Our colleagues in Ghana, thank you very much. Please, I don't want to interrupt.
Thank you, Prof. Yes. So we have about 30 minutes to bring all of this together. We also have to consider Muslim brothers and sisters who are fasting, who need to break their fast soon. So quickly, if you have any questions, 1 minute. If you have any contributions, 1 minute, so that we can take as many people as possible. Adebayo Ajala, kindly go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much. I think my heart bleeds when I was looking at the high rev, and two things occurred to me. One, do we as citizens of this country understand the words of our national pledge? And secondly, at the level of the polling units, do the presiding officers, do they know simple arithmetic? Because when you look at many of the things, it's addition and errors of writing. Whether this is deliberate or not is one thing. And finally, because I don't want to exceed my 1 minute, is there a quality assurance process in distribution of ballot papers? Because when you look at the whole thing, there is no formula for anything. In some polling units, there were three voters, and you had the same retinue of staff, but that's not it. And you give to that polling unit about 250 ballot papers. And in some other places where you have 300 and something, you give them 400 ballot papers. So what informed the distribution of ballot papers? So the quality assurance process itself, don't let us talk about the uploading or not, but I think the thing that really pains me is, are we going to expect foreigners to come and conduct elections for us? Can't we do something intelligently? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please, panel members, kindly take notes to respond at the end of Grillo Ade Dolapo.
Yeah.
We can't hear you clearly. Your line is shaky. Yes, it's better now. Good evening.
Yeah, first, let me say greetings to my EQ. I'm actually surprised. But then, my comment.
We can't hear you clearly. It seems there's issues with your audio. All right, can we have Philip Olatunji? Philip Olatunji, kindly go ahead. Unmute and speak. Okay, Mustafa Said, if you are available, please go ahead.
Yes, I am, and thank you for the opportunity. Good day, everyone. Yeah, for me, I want to start with an observation I have made in the whole controversy around the election, and it revolves around some of the points that have already been recognized in the conversation, and that is the loopholes in the Electoral Act. Often legislations are made in such a way that because of the often bipartisan kind of struggle that is involved in getting legislations passed, we tend to become complacent. Democracies typically, I think, not just Nigeria, but most times you see how citizens would usually compromise because they just want to get something passed, just to get like a symbolic, implementation of some sort of interest. And for me, this has happened in the way we went about the new Electoral Act 2022, because right now a lot of candidates in the election are going to go to court, and from my observation, it seems like most of the things that happen in the election, most of the impunity that has happened, we've just seen what happened today in Adamawa. It seems as though people do these things because they know that nothing is going to happen. Not just that nothing is going to happen, but legally there are loopholes that don't allow judges to make decisions in a way that favor what is right, or like truth, basically. So I just want to ask Cynthia, going further, because this is our country, and like we just have to, we have to continue, basically, right? The fact that 2020 elections were disastrous doesn't mean that elections wouldn't take place again. The elections would continue to take place, hopefully, as we build a democracy. What can we do to improve the Electoral Act? Because for me, I believe that we still need to continue in the struggle for a better Electoral Act, because given explicit laws that would, make it easy for elections to be annulled, for results to be accepted, or otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about these things. We've seen what happened today, for example, in Adamawa. It's easy for INEC to come and say, look, this is what we need to do. Like, a certain section of the Electoral Act states that results have to be cleared by this person or that person. Like, this designation is supposed to be the person, declare results. So in the absence of that, obviously INEC could just come and say, okay, this is wrong, or like we are not accepting this declaration. What can we do in the Electoral Act to make it easier for results to be rejected without having to debate around things that are obviously wrong? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Aliyu Abdul Fattah, unmute and speak.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me once again congratulate the organizers and the panelists who put up a very, very informed discourse on this matter of electoral, the last 2023 election, the conduct of the election. Sirs, I just want to express my frustration as a way of question. You see, I really appreciate this. Is it Aisha, the lady that gave the rundown about the history of electoral malpractices that has been happening in Nigeria from the 1960s, or in fact 1950s. I think she quoted one of the electoral officers, Ahmadu Kurfi, also in his book, expressing that the futility, let me even say, about the effort to get entrenched, enthroned democracy through this electoral means. My question really is to you, the intellectuals, whether we always need to continue along this path. We have been spending billions and billions of naira every year, it, over the years. And this exercise has never, ever brought up any result that is that satisfies either the democratic move to establish democratic governance in the country, or even to address the problems of the ordinary person. So can we not now start thinking about something different must it always be this election where we continue to come out after the exercise to come and express our frustration, the glaring ineptitude of the electoral umpires and the electoral actors? So is it not time for us as African academics or political scientists to look at other means of getting competent leaders to run our affairs rather than this cycle of deceit every year?
Thank you, Mr. Ali.
Thank you very much.
Let me add a voice to that. And I've asked Jibrin this question many, many times. Do we need this democracy? Is it the only option we have?
Or rather, do you mean elections or democracy, Prof? Is the election the way to go, or is it democracy as a concept?
Is the Chinese model not working effectively?
But that's democracy. Chinese democracy.
Can we have Chinese democracy, if that's the way you want to call it?
All right, I'm sure Professor Jibri would have something to say. We're running out of time. Festus Adejoro, please. Quickly, 1 minute for question or response.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be on this program and to join this debate. I mean, this interactive session on the 2023 election. I'm actually just curious about a few things. The first is that the House of Rep, the Senate, and the presidential election was conducted the same day. So obviously, by and large, we expect the BVAS totals for the 3 elections to tally. Obviously, there could be 1 or 2 voters who would decline not voting, whatever. How does this total differ? Because a whole lot of information we hear is that elections were padded in some places, which I think with House of Rep and Senate totals, we might be able to see a trend or match. My second worry is that I know that each political party always have their situation room where they get response from their party agent at the polling unit. Obviously, a party like Labour Party didn't have that across all of that. What is the picture of the situation room for example, with the PDP? How does it correlate with what INEC eventually announced? If not for anything, it's just for common man on the street to have a feel of what is actually what we should get as compared to what INEC eventually declared. The court of public opinion before, talking about the judiciary. I want to ask the third question on the ward collation officer. Interestingly, I partook in an election before 2019 election as a ward collation officer before I left Nigeria. Are ward collation officers mandated to verify BVAS record, Form C8A, and ballot papers in terms of the new INEC guideline to match? Because for me, I believe it is difficult to rig elections beyond the polling unit. And it is contrary to what we are hearing in the news. Because how do, electoral officers become culpable in manipulations after the polling unit? I'm just kind of, at a loss in these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Quickly, Emeka Nwadiora.
Thank you very much.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Chido, for your opportunity. I appreciate that. For those of us who've been in the diaspora for about 40 years and are planning to come back to Nigeria, the question I ask is, given the outcome of the jaundiced elections, what is the future of that country called Nigeria? Where are we headed to?
Thank you. Since you mentioned diaspora, perhaps our eminent panel would also want to look at the prospects. We've been on this for many, many years. What about Nigerians outside Nigeria and their rights to vote?
Emeka, are you based in Australia?
No, I've been a professor at Temple University for the past 35 years.
Okay, now I know you, because there's one Emeka based in Australia and was putting up a lot of videos on YouTube.
Not me, sir.
Okay, so we have Blessing Ajishafe. Please go ahead,
Thank you so much, sir. My question is very straightforward. The problems with academics in managing our elections, especially returning officers, vice chancellors, high caliber professors, but often and often we have been seen compromise by them, and the public has been levying allegations against the academic community, and especially the coinage professors help to rig elections. How do we handle this? I'm not talking about political science, scientists generally. I'm talking about, the academic community generally, specifically vice chancellors who are resident and who are returning officers. How do we handle the situation, please? It's becoming embarrassing.
Okay, Grillo, we have you back. Kindly ask your question. Please go ahead, Grillo.
Okay. Yes, I just want to make a quick comment. I think for me, the issue that affected me the most concerning this election was the ethnic strife that really presented it or reared its ugly head. We noticed a lot of people insulting themselves based on I'm from this tribe, you're from this tribe, go back home to vote if you want to have leaders. You are not from here, so you cannot have leaders. And personally for me, I feel like Nigeria does not heal. Like since the beginning of this nation, since we had the first coup and everything, we did not heal. We just moved on. And now it seems as we are advancing in our democracy, as we are growing as a nation, this problem is coming back and it's getting hotter. I don't know. It's more like in Lagos after the election, it was very difficult for many of my friends to travel and move. Everybody just wanted to stay in the comfort of their home just to feel safe. You understand? And I think it's something that we should have a conversation on. What is the solution for this ethnic issue affecting us as a nation? Because if we cannot agree on how we want to live and promise that we would stay and love each other and choose our leaders together without resorting to insults based on ethnic representations, then what is the future as a nation? I think that's what I really want to.
Thank you very much, Grillo. I think you raised an important question. Nigeria does not heal. We would have to find a way to heal, because that's really the only way to move forward. We have two more people and we're really, really out of time. Philip Olatunji in 1 minute, and then we have Martin Hembe. Or Martin Hembe, if you're ready. Please unmute and go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? I've muted. Good evening.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Can hear you.
Taking up from the unhealing issue that the last person raised, this question is to Professor Jibo. Please, Prof, don't you think it's about time Nigeria considers a proportional representation system, or rather the mixed member system, to address this problem of lack of proper representation in government, sort of? Thank you.
All right, thank you. And okay, no more question. We'll just quickly, we have about 10 minutes to wrap this up. We'll go back to the panelists, and there are questions around quality assurance, around the election, impunity, whether democracy or election is the way to go, BVAS verification, integrity, the professors or academics who are supposed to do a better job in conducting elections. I will start with Professor Jibril. If you could take, and you don't have to answer all the questions, just address those you feel comfortable addressing, and then we'll go around.
Thank you, Chido. Let me just address some of the issues. Presiding officers, lots of errors. I think it's a general problem about lack of quality of Nigerians at this point in time. I remember when we went through COVID and did the vaccination, and there are all these reports that people traveling with their vaccination cards had a lot of problem abroad because there are too many mistakes in the forms that were filled. My family and I went to check our forms, and every one of us, there were mistakes in writing the names, the age, the passport number, almost everything systematically had mistakes. is a significant decline in the quality of training, and specifically with regards to INEC, often they do not go through enough training to simply master the process, and I think that's something we need to work on. Specifically about ASU and returning officers, let's not forget why academics were taken as returning officers. When a major review of election processes were done in 2010, it was discovered that state governors used to be extremely powerful in determining electoral outcomes. And that's because they know the resident electoral commissioner in their state conducts the election. They become very charming. They compromise them, they provide them, and when the elections come, these people return the favor. The idea of getting returning officers from the university and getting them late so that nobody knows who will be the returning officer till just days before the election is to address that problem. And although we've had problems of some of them being compromised, on the whole, most of the returning officers from the university have done a relatively good job. And I always complain about the fact that one or two people do something wrong, and those examples will be used to characterize all the others as being in the same mold, and that's not the case. In terms of the idea of do we give up on elections and democracy in Nigeria, Professor Falola always raises this, and I always tell him, I always give him the same response back, that when you look at developing countries in general, Asia had authoritarianism, but it was nationalist authoritarianism, and it was used for nation building. Study African history. The authoritarianism we had was extremely negative. It was destructive of development, rights, democracy, everything. The alternative democracy to go back to that sort of authoritarianism. And I said, no, it is not by accident that for the last 40 years, the African people have fought hard for democracy. They have gained that democracy, and they are finding out that that democracy is not perfect. No democracy is perfect. No democracy does have answers to all the problems. But you can improve your elections, you can improve your democracy. And I've always made the point that since 2011, we've had incremental improvements in our democratic system and in our electoral system. Do not forget, in 1999, for example, a President Obasanjo can just decide, okay, I've chosen this guy to be Speaker of the House of Representatives. I've chosen this guy to be the President of Senate. Can the President do that today? No, he can't. Hasn't the equilibrium in terms of the separation of powers shifted considerably in this country? Hasn't it been the case that since 2011, each election has been better than the previous one? That's why I always warn. This attitude of saying, oh, there are things that were wrong in this election, they are all the same. No, they are not. It means people are not studying this election. They are not focused on the content, and they are not seeing the gains that are being made. I always say, look at the gains that are made, build on them, improve upon them, and all that. Isn't it a time that we examine our majoritarian first past the post system of elections? On that one, I agree completely. I strongly support the change to proportional representation, because the problem with the majoritarian first past the post system is that it creates winners and everybody else is a loser. And this makes the fight in an election a desperate fight to the finish, because you are going to produce winners and losers. Take this presidential election results that we're looking at. When you take the second and the third in the presidential results, that's the majority of Nigerians. So we are, for the first time in the Fourth Republic, having a presidential election winner that has a minority of the votes cast, and it's going to have all the powers of the president. Proportional forms of representation are much more reflective about the power and strength of political parties. And when we were in the Electoral Reform Committee in 2008, 2009, we made a strong pitch for adding a proportional dose to our electoral system. Of course, that has never been taken up, but one of my recommendations today is that let's look back at the Ways report and many of the excellent recommendations that we made to improve the electoral system that have not been implemented. One is the Electoral Offense Tribunal. Currently, INEC is supposed to prosecute electoral offenders. INEC is not a prosecutorial body. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. If you have a specialist tribunal that does that, you will significantly increase the number of electoral offenders that are punished for their crimes. Second body we recommended strongly, Political Party Regulatory Commission. But we said running elections is a very difficult and complex business in this country. To reduce the activities of INEC so that they can focus and concentrate just in running our election. And some of these other duties can be taken up by others. Of course, the third strong recommendation we made that was never taken up, this whole question of election tribunals. And we pointed that in our report in 2009. Why is it that you swear in somebody into power when the case of whether he won or lost that election is an election tribunal? And we said, do elections 7 months before inauguration and make sure both the tribunal and the appeals are done within 6 months. And our chairman was the Chief Justice of Nigeria, so he knows about this thing, that it is possible to conclude all the tribunal cases within 6 months. And when you know who the final winner is, you can then inaugurate the right person into that position, rather than this idea of, okay, let me rig the election, you go to court, meanwhile I'll be sworn in and I'll use my power as a state governor or whatever to make sure that you don't succeed in your case in the electoral tribunal. So I think there's a lot of room for improvements in our system. And if we continue along the path of improvement, this despondency I'm seeing will begin to reduce, because we should never give up on improving our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 4 minutes. Aisha, 2 minutes for you and 2 minutes for Cynthia, so that we can quickly
please let them talk. Let them talk.
No, don't worry, Prof. I was going to just tell Chido that I must speak my mind.
Let them talk, please. Let them talk.
Giving Chido his time, they are not letting me.
Let them talk, please.
Okay. Why
let
not?
Let them talk for as much as they want, please.
Please go ahead, Aisha.
Going ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the thoughtful questions that people asked. I'm not going to try and answer all of them, obviously, but I think that Adebayo Ajala talked about the quality of the presiding officers, and there's been an attempt, but I just wanted to add to that particular one that I think part of the problem is just no consequences. We never really review elections. I mean, after 2023, after 2019, after 2015, 15, we get all these recommendations that come from different bodies, EU, and it's just there. And we pick and choose like a buffet what we want to attend to, and we leave the majority, but there's no real review in terms of crimes. So let me give an example. After the gubernatorial elections, the police, the IGP says that they've arrested 781 people for electoral related crimes. And my own thought was, what about the over 200 of last year? Oh, sorry, of the last election? What happened to them? How were they prosecuted? Who was punished for what they did? We have the insurrectionists from the January 6th event in the US. 2 years after, they're still prosecuting people. As early as maybe 2-3 weeks ago, 3 more people went to jail. Over 1,000 people have been successfully prosecuted for their roles in the January 6th insurrection. Who has been, where are the stories of people who did wrong during elections and have gone to jail or have been punished in any way? So it's the same thing. You have the returning officers. It might be an issue of low quality, but it also could just be connivance and lack of integrity, but none of those things are looked at and there are no consequences. So for me, I keep turning back to consequences, consequences, consequences. We need that. For Mustafa Said, what should we do to improve the Electoral Act? And the first thing I wrote was proportional representation, which Jibo has spoken to, so I won't say that. But I think there's the soft bigotry of low expectations, even for ourselves. Yes, most meaningful reforms take time. Most meaningful reforms are slow to happen, but we have to be more innovative. And I think for me, that's where my hope in Nigeria actually lies. That the fact is, honestly, if we're serious with our review, we'll find that really very little has actually reformed. We're doing the same thing over and over again, and we're expecting very radical results, which is a definition of madness. So yes, with proportional representation, that might help. Obviously, with other constitutional reforms that reduce the incentives to be in office will also help. A lot of the things we've talked about, being in government is just so lucrative. In other countries, if you're a parliamentarian, you're not living the kind of lives, you're not earning the kind of money that our legislators earn. So there's too much incentive to get into power. So we need to reduce those things. And there are big and small things, including another one that I'm always advocating for, reducing the number of days that we have elections. I still see no reason whatsoever why we split up elections into presidential, National Assembly, and gubernatorial. And people will say it's because we're largely illiterate. No, Nigerians are very political. We know how to vote. We know what it takes to count your votes. Wait. Most people know about those facts. I actually don't agree with the comments that have been made earlier that we don't know what it is to run elections. What citizens need to know, the counting side, maybe not, but what it takes to stay at your polling unit, defend your vote. People even say that in Hausa, they count it, and then you post it, and then you take it to the collation center. People know those things. So we need to end this charade of splitting up our elections into 2 different days. There's a rigging formula between the president and the governors that favors that division. So we also need to be creative about the kind of reforms that we're pushing and not just keep doing the same things over and over again. In terms of radical, again, just speaking to radical, I'm not saying we shouldn't practice democracy. I'm also in favor of democracy. I think we're overburdening democracy with providing so many things when we ourselves, mostly as citizens, are not putting in our own efforts in what it takes to be a democracy. Democracy, as has been pointed out, is beyond elections. It's literally a way of life. And we generally don't seem to be very democratic. When you look at the kind of politicians that we applaud for holding their state. And I keep asking, when you say somebody has held their state, what does it mean to hold a state? Are you holding it with good governance, or are you holding it with abuse of power, theft, and being undemocratic? Those are the things it takes to hold a state. That's what it takes to be in power, to decide who is going to get all the seats in all the different roles in your party. That's what it takes to hold a state or a country. Is that democracy? So we ourselves need a lot of education. And again, it's not just civic education, it is life education. The quality of our education, the history, what is in our curriculums is actually poor. We cannot keep overburdening INEC, civil society, donor agencies with saying everything is civic education. No, the quality of our curriculums in our primary schools, in our secondary schools, in our universities have to change, have to improve to actually groom and raise a different generation of Nigerians who think differently. And that cannot just happen within election cycles of civic education. So I think those are also opportunities for us. I think Emeka asked, what's the future of the country post the 2023 elections? It depends on who you ask. I would say, honestly, I do not see us, if there's not some sort of demand, I do not see Nigeria becoming more democratic. And it's not, again, about the elections. You can have regular elections, but you're becoming more and more authoritarian. You're a competitive authoritarian state. Elections happen regularly, but there's no democracy. If we look at the person who's the president-elect and that person's track record in Lagos State, we're not going to get more democracy. If we look at the attitudes, the kinds of commentary we're getting with regards to media freedoms, we're not going to become more democratic. So I actually have a lot of fear, but that doesn't mean that we should give up. What's the future for the country? The future for the country is that more people just dig in, just stay in there. We've had a lot of gains with Labour Party. We've had gains with NMPP and YP. You know, we are indeed do have the most diverse National Assembly that we've had in a long time. We need to build on that, but I think citizens are going to have to be a lot more political about their choices. We're going to be a lot more political about how we engage. I know cancel culture is supposed to be a bad thing, but honestly, in Nigeria, I actually think we need cancel culture. Cancel culture is what happens maybe online, but in real life, we need to bring cancel culture into our real lives. Who we invite to things, who we honor, basically, who we honor in Nigeria is part of what needs to be done to address what's going on in the country. But we're almost dysfunctional. With one mouth, we complain about Nigeria, the abuse of power, but in another mouth, we glorify those who are responsible for those things. We cannot have it both ways. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cynthia, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the questions connecting to the elections. And I know we had a question around totals of result, the presidential, the House of Reps and all. Well, the thing is, each election is the result is recorded on their respective results form. So there's a different form, EC8A for presidential, EC8A for Senate, EC8A for House of Reps. And so the only data that would be a bit unifying in that particular spectrum of election is the data of accredited voters, because it's the same number of accredited voters that get to vote. But when it comes to the results, we can only rely on the EC8A for the presidential elections, which is where a lot of issues had come up. And I know a comment was made around if what the clarity in the law and what should be the next phase for electoral reform. I've heard a lot of conversation around the legality or otherwise of the IREV or the BVAS. Why the Electoral Act did not use the term BVAS. In fact, the Electoral Act says smart card reader or any technological device. Hence, and then INEC decided to deploy the BVAS. For electronic transmission, it did not mention IREV. It says INEC has the power to determine the mode of transmission. And then INEC in its guideline talked about the procedure for transmission and introduced IREV. But Section 64 of the Electoral Act, so beyond Section 60, if you read Section 64 of the Electoral Act, sub 4, 64.4, it says, a collation officer or returning officer at an election shall collate and announce the result of an election, subject to his or her verification and confirmation that, I'll read paragraph B, that the votes stated on the collated results are correct and consistent with the votes or results recorded and transmitted directly from the polling unit under 64 of the Act. So it gives two, in that section, there is an intention that there are two modes that were adopted. It talks about collated directly on the results, and that's transmitted. So there's an expectation that there were two modes of transmission that was done, or transfer of report, which is where INEC draws its powers also to deploy the IREV. I just wanted to provide that. So if we're talking around clarity in the law and electoral reform, I believe that an electoral law should not, one, be so limitive that it doesn't give the Electoral Commission powers to expand or innovate, which is why I wouldn't push for the Electoral Act to mention things like IREV or BVAS and all of that. Just give INEC the powers to do that. And then INEC in its guidelines can innovate and introduce issues or rather procedures to guide the process, as because the Act also gives INEC the powers to make policy. So if that is the case, it's just for me, it's just political, it's when political shenanigans, basically. People understand that they could interpret the law in any way. And that is why ordinarily, if we had an independent judiciary, our hope would be in the way the court would interpret the law. But now there are questions around the independence of the judiciary and how it interprets the law, because we've also seen some judgments that raises major questions on specific interpretations of the law. But if we're looking at other opportunities for reform, because I do believe the opportunities for reform post elections, and I'm glad Professor Jibo mentioned the Waste Committee report, but because one of the opportunities actually is to go back to that report. Proportional representation was highlighted, which is a constitutional matter. Introduction of the Electoral Offences Commission and Tribunal was also in that report. Independence, power of appointment was also in that report. It talks about reviewing the appointment of the national leadership of the Electoral Commission, so the INEC chair, the national commissioners, and the resident electoral commissioners. So perhaps we already have a template on what our reform agenda ought to be, learning from these elections. And I do believe we need to revisit that Waste report, because they were innovations that if they were adopted over a period of time, it would have reduced the contest, or rather the desperation in the contest and the attempts to undermine the integrity of the process. That's one. The other part is conducting elections on the same day, and Aisha also made that mention. If you go to Kenya, every election, they have 5 ballot boxes, all the elections conducted on the same day. And I do believe that this was one of the proposals in the last electoral reform process, but it did not make it through because of the politics of that particular provision. Why? There is the political parties want to have the presidential elections first because they believe that it would inform how the governorship election will go, which is what we saw. That post the presidential elections, our issues around identity were intensified, but you now had governors and political parties who were willing to fight at all costs, undermining the process, which is why the governorship elections had more reports of violent destruction of the process, violence. We had more loss of lives in the governorship elections, and we had more inconclusive elections from the governorship. And I do believe that an agenda we ought to push for in the next reform process post this election is unifying the conduct of elections to one day. Let's have every elections conducted one day. It saves us money and it saves us time, because you know what you're doing is for personnel costs, you're focusing on paying people for just one day. But what you're doing, if you're having elections on different days, you have additional budgets for personnel for both INEC and security for different elections. Logistics, if cost alone would be saved if we have elections conducted in one day. And I do agree that Nigerians when it comes to elections, we're a bit sophisticated in understanding the issues and how to vote. And what makes this important is simple to understand. As simple as this election, we had voters who voted for different parties for different offices. In some locations, people voted for APC for governor and for presidential, PDP for Senate, Labour Party for House of Reps. So, and it was the same elections, 3 ballot papers. So what are we learning? That our voters are actually educated enough to understand how to thumbprint for the parties they care about. And so that question of we're going to confuse voters if we have elections on one day does not suffice. And I do believe that that is an agenda we ought to push for in the electoral reform. So those are the 4 things: independence of INEC, proportional representation, elections in one day, and electoral offences commission or tribunal, as the case may be. The other question around quality assurance, for me, it's about logistics and operations management. Why? INEC has an operations framework when it comes to deployment of materials for elections. The voter register previously is collected across polling units informs the production of the deployment of ballot papers to those polling units. For these elections, there were major issues around planning. First, INEC created new polling units in 2021, and it took them almost over a year, almost 2 years, to reallocate voters to these polling units. The idea of creating new polling units was to decongest some polling units and bring the polling units closer to the voters. So basically, voter access. But we still had polling units with as high as 3,000 voters registered, and some polling units as low as 3 voters registered. However, in the planning, which is why I talk about logistics and operations management, an electoral commission that has this information should know that if a polling unit has 3 voters, then these are the numbers of ballot papers to be sent to this location. Those with 3,000, these are the numbers to be sent to those locations. In fact, the plan was for polling units with more than 750 voters registered, they would have 2 BVAS machines or 3 deployed to minimize congestion and minimize the pace and rather ensure fast pace of accreditation of voters. But in the implementation, there was a major challenge. And I think this in itself is more of a policy reform within the commission. It doesn't need the Electoral Act amendment. And so the conversation in the electoral reform also requires engagement with the Electoral Commission on policy reform, as simple as logistics management, as simple as polling units that are equitably, or rather has equitable distribution of voters, and the capacity of the personnel managing the elections at every level, because you have at the national, the state, and the local level. Those are important conversations that need to be had, but that is an institutional reform that we actually as a people need to start to push on the part of INEC. We cannot constantly deal with logistics challenge every elections. We should get better and not keep going backwards. The conversation around democracy, and I think I do agree with the comments made already. I believe in democracy. Why? It's as simple as this Zoom meeting. If we were not in a democracy, having this conversation via Zoom would have been a major of life, an issue of life and death, because we're talking about questions that affect people, the state in itself, and the state do not like people challenging it. And so for me, the concept of democracy is about freedom, more freedom. But democracy in itself would not deliver if the people do not make the system to demand. So it's not just about those in office, it's about our attitude as a people in a democracy. And I'll give a simple example with abuse of power. Abuse of power, when there was naira scarcity in Nigeria, the POS merchants became the lords and the gods. And they were charging the average Nigerians huge sums of money to just withdraw money, because at that point, they were those in power. So imagine such a POS person elected into office. We can't expect that person to be democratic in their conduct, which is why for me, conversation around democracy is not just about the leaders or those in office, it's about the people itself, how we interact and engage the government or the state institutions, how we appreciate the concept of social contract, and how we understand the importance of freedom, equality, justice, and inclusion. And I think democracy works when the people get it to work, and there are no perfect systems. I think Jibo has said that there are no perfect systems. The challenge we have as a people is our refusal to tell ourselves the truth. And until we tell ourselves the truth and hold ourselves accountable, we cannot have the quality of governance that we want. Because try to fight corruption. The moment you start to engage, before you know it, you start saying, we are fighting this person's brother, identities begin to play up, and then we forget the major issues and focus on our differences based on our identities. So even the way we engage is not even it doesn't come from a sense of understanding what democracy is. And I think, like I said, I do believe in democracy, but we need that major overhaul of our mindset on how we engage. And democracy is about the people. It's about the people demanding that the system works, but the people also being responsible to hold themselves accountable, but also hold the leaders accountable, that we all become our own accountability partners, and that the issues around identity will remain with us. There's no glory days. I don't believe that the military period was a glory days. I don't believe that the 60s were glory days. Why? Nigeria as a country, we've existed around several regional identities. If you read this book, My Life, it talks about why the first move for independence in Nigeria was not adopted. The first time a move for independence in Nigeria was done by Antonio Enaro. The major issues were basically an issue of identity. Was the North ready? So we cannot begin to think that identities began today. But what we have not agreed or accepted is that first, these identities exist. Let's accept that. And the identities are important to us as a people. Let's accept that. Once we accept that, then we begin to create a system that ensures that everyone feels included and everyone feels a sense of justice. But we can't keep saying, let us forget this identity, because we know it has been there from day one. So can we agree that, yes, we have these differences? This is where we are. Now, how can we build a system that promotes justice and equality? Because I do believe that if every section of society feels that they are part of the system, then issues of identity will not be manipulated during politics. The reason it is manipulated is because during politics, politicians go with the message that it is either our time or power ought to be with us. But if we all know that regardless of who gets into office, every section will be catered for, then we will not be fighting over our identities. And I think that is where we need to begin from. Let us accept our identities and build a system that promotes justice and equality. And I think my last point will be around our system of education. Aisha made a conversation, raised and made a point around that. As simple as civil war is not discussed in schools. So the conversations around what led to the civil war will still remain, because even the younger people talk about civil war from stories people told them that may not be the accurate reflection of what happened. And so you talk to an average young person in different parts of the world, the way they talk about the civil war is from a place of disinformation. Yes, books may have been written, but we are not taught about that in schools. And so if we can't even learn as simple as what led to the civil war and how was that resolved, we don't even learn about the several ethnic crises that has happened in parts like Plateau and Kaduna and different parts of the country. We don't learn about these things. So how can we solve them? So once we are faced with the challenges in our current time, the younger generation would only rely on some stories they were told, and it further creates this unity. So our education system honestly needs an overhaul. We need to begin to teach our people our history, how we got to where we are, what led to that, what even were the issues, because there'll be several issues around that, but we all don't look at that. So at the end of it all, everyone is feeling victimized because we don't even know the stories. And for me, if we can't teach our people our history, we don't know where we're coming from, then how do we define where we are going to? So if you ask me, what is the future of Nigeria post these elections and all the fallouts from the elections, I do believe in this country called Nigeria. And I know that every election is very divisive. For me, what is important is the future is only determined by what we do today, the actions we're taking today. So I don't know what the future looks like, but I believe that the future would be possible if we begin to address some of these challenges from these elections, one issue at a time. And if we begin to unify around those issues to demand accountability, the courts may not deliver the judgments we hope for. I don't know what the judge should be deciding. The judges should be deciding around these cases in courts. But we should not subject our whole democracy based on the judgments of the courts, because the decisions of the court also is a determinant of the presence of democracy or not. But rather, we should start to ask ourselves, what are the indices and indicators that would get us a democracy that we want? And regardless of what the judiciary's decision is, or regardless of what the outcome of the election is, that we are committed to build the system. Because whether we leave Nigeria or Japan to any other place, at the end, the work is still left for us to do. Most people who leave the country 40, 50 years after want to return back. So for me, it's working now to get the system to work. But at the end of the day, if Nigeria succeeds, if Nigeria works, then we all benefit from that. And that for me is where the hope is, that we engage the system from a holistic point of view, not from a single prism of just the outcome of the elections or what the judges will decide, but rather from the things that make us who we are, the differences that we need to address, and how, as a people, we define that democracy needs to work, but it's a responsibility on every one of us, not just those who are elected into office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So aptly put. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Professor Jubre Ibrahim, and thank you for everyone who has stayed the course with us. It's been almost 2.5 hours of stimulating conversation. I don't think this is the end of it. We hope you would oblige us when we bring you back again. I'll hand over to Professor Falola to end this officially. Thank you once again on behalf of Professor Falola and the Tony Falola interview. Prof, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And Cynthia has done all of us a big favor with that remarkable closure. 3 things will immediately follow. This will be released. The entire interview will be released in the next 10 minutes, not edited, for people to begin to put to use. And I will write 4 reports on your interview as part of my own understanding of what you've said. The media will cover it. I do not know what they're going to say. And I'm very grateful that we are able not to get into the frame of politicians who fight one another, and the integrity of scholarship and integrity of what we all represent is sustained. The takeaway on identity that Cynthia just brought up, democracy by Jibril, the process beyond the civic responsibility that Aisha brilliantly articulated. And let me finish with complications, that if we are able to empower many of our people with infrastructure, with electricity, maybe they will begin gradually to delete us or rock from the routines of their lives. And this centralization, which is a grip on all of us, we begin to loosen. If the mama put selling his food, and Mama Yabo pepper soup, if they have the infrastructure to do their jobs very well, maybe they will be decentralizing their thinking. The imposition of Abuja on all their lives. And I think we have a unique country. And people do not sometimes appreciate this uniqueness. That we are not like India, which is bigger, but with dominant control of the Hindu. We are not like China, with the dominant control of one ethnicity. We have a system in which we have many ethnicities not able to dominate the other ones. And each of them trying to set the balance for everyone. And even the rich people, they lack the capacity to dominate the poor. They can flaunt their wealth, but the poor keeps challenging them. And so all these benefits remain, and our uniqueness, I think, will sustain our future in spite of the frustration that we are going through today. I thank all of you, and I'm still going to challenge Ibrahim to this democracy issue. I can fly to Abuja. Maybe we set up another debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's Kelpie Vibes.
Yeah. Baby, you know that I'm in a choco. Baby, you know that I'm in a choco.